Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Max Verstappen is still coming under fire, and this time it's not just from the FIA. Apparently, after the big swearing row a couple of weeks ago, another one of his colleagues on the grid has actually suggested Max should not be swearing and should effectively act more like a world champion or as a better role model for the rest of the grid. Is this actually a valid report, given it comes from one of the FIA stewards? What is actually going on here behind the scenes? Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always. I greatly appreciate it. We've got plenty to get into today because there's been big developments, really. One of which being the following. We know that Cadillac are pairing up with Andretti Global for, well, intending to get onto the Formula 1 grid now for 2028, effectively. We don't really know if that's going to happen. Andretti had a bit of drama a few days ago when, well, Michael Andretti stepped down, basically, or at least, well, he didn't necessarily step down from his role entirely, but he got rid of his ownership, basically, stepped down into a different type of operational role. So it's kind of unclear why. And at the same time, Zach Brown, who for some reason was on, like, the board of directors over there, also stepped down. We haven't really heard much more on that, but we know that things are happening, and rumours are now suggesting that maybe Cadillac will just try and do it themselves or partner with somebody else to get into Formula 1 if Andretti are just going to get rejected. And the rumour has it that, I think it was Greg Maffei from Liberty, rumoured anyway, basically told Michael Andretti, I'm never letting you in the sport for whatever reason. Like, and obviously that doesn't seem fair to me, given they tick the boxes as far as I'm concerned, but they don't tick the boxes for the right people in the money category, I suppose, and Andretti therefore probably won't get a spot easily on the grid, and therefore Cadillac might decide to do something else. They could, of course, go to Alpine and just try and buy them. I mean, that would be a feasible option as it stands right now. Now, speaking of Alpine, Otmar Shafsnoy was actually on the High Performance podcast with Jake Humphries and the guys, and talking about a fair few things, one of which was pretty remarkable, actually, a couple of things to be fair. When he took that job at Alpine, he was apparently told that everyone was going to report to me, and I was the boss, effectively, and when he gets there, that ain't the case. It's just politics, isn't it, right? And a team like Alpine, definitely that is everywhere. There was also a remarkable admission, though, that he made, that back in the Force India days, he actually paid for the salaries of his employees that weren't getting paid as the team struggled. So, you know, different time in Formula 1 for sure, but he said he did that on a couple of occasions. So, yeah, remarkable history that some of these things you never really get to know until these guys years later talk about things publicly. He also talked about the contract debacle with Piastri, saying that they mistakenly announced him as their driver using a clause that would already, so I think we kind of knew this stuff, but he was like, it weren't my fault, occurred before I was there as a tenure, technically before his tenure took over. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of not the beginning of the downfall really, but at least at that point they were a reasonably competitive team. The last couple of years has been an absolute disaster, relatively speaking, for Alpine, and turns out Piastri made a rather good decision at the time. Now, we've got upgrades on the way as well. We know that Austin is going to be rammed full of upgrades at the Circuit of the Americas in a couple of weeks' time. Charles and Carlos, Ferrari drivers, they are on track today, or basically tomorrow, right, on Wednesday, at Mugello for Pirelli tyre test. Now, this is potentially coming at an interesting time. I mean, we'll see. Can they bring the upgrades to the car like for the test? Maybe not. It depends what's ready, what they can try on the car. Just because we know that in an ideal world, you can do a test either right before or just after, ideally before a Grand Prix weekends, so you can try out those new parts. So assuming they're ready for the Ferrari, they can probably bolt them on the car as long as they're legal spec, I guess. Maybe it doesn't matter for these tyre tests. But anyway, they're going to run probably whatever they're trying to run for Austin, assuming that it's ready. And that's always the question, right? Whether, sure, you design the parts, you manufacture the parts, that's a different process and that takes longer to accomplish. So there are upgrades in the works for the Ferrari team, for the Red Bull guys, for McLaren as well, we're pretty sure is also possible. And yeah, Pirelli tyre testing tomorrow, not just for Ferrari, but Red Bull and McLaren are also there. So Red Bull are apparently going to be looking towards a 2025 spec car, and McLaren are even going to prototype some plans for 2026, apparently. So at least that's kind of how I'm reading this. So I think it's going to be pretty interesting either way. And also interesting that Red Bull are looking for next year's car, because we know that they need next year's car to work. Obviously, otherwise Max might just leave if the team continues to decline. But equally, they really need, in order to make 2025 work, the rest of this year to work. It was actually a big talking point during 2022 that Mercedes needed to get their cars back on track, so they brought upgrade after upgrade to the W13. Seems to start to understand the car a bit more. They won in Brazil, they got the 1-2. That probably convinced them they were back on the right track for the W14. That never happened, of course, but it is important to actually do well at the end of a season, because then you can be pretty confident that next year's car, as a step on from that, is going to be a good step on from that, and you can only really be super confident in next year's car working as intended if the current car is performing. And right now Red Bull have upgrades to bring to the current car to try and fix it, and if they don't fix it, then whatever they work on for 2025 is not exactly guaranteed to succeed. Quickly on Nico Hülkenberg, we know that he's joining Audi, Sauber, for next year, and Sauber are not the greatest team right now by any stretch of the imagination. I just wonder whether in the future, is this going to come back to bite Hülkenberg? I don't really think it will, because he does say that Haas, with their current investment drive, will help it become a serious competitor in years to come. Now, is there actually an investment drive at Haas? I mean, not as far as I'm concerned, because the rumour was that Gene Haas weren't bothered about, investing into the team, because he thought that Steiner or someone else but Steiner, let's say Ai Komatsu, could have done a better job than him with the resources they had. Turns out that seems to pretty much be true, based on what we have seen with Haas over this season so far. And they've done pretty well. They've scored a decent amount of points. Certainly Nico Hülkenberg has, and he's going to go to Sauber and probably score barely any points next season. But I guess for Hülkenberg, his true ambition is, to get a podium and to win a race, right? And who knows from there. And Haas are realistically never going to achieve that. Audi potentially could. Like, as a works team, it's possible. Like, Haas realistically never will. So I don't think it's a decision that he'll regret, but I think it's definitely possible that Hülkenberg is getting rings ran around him by Haas's lineup next season, whereas he is potentially at the back of the grid fighting for all the scraps that he can potentially get. One other update on Ferrari power. We know that in 2022 it was a big talking point because the Ferrari power unit was not especially reliable, and they upped the limit to 4 power units per season. Then there was rumours they were going to put it back to 3. No, it's going to stay at 4. Now there's 24 rounds. There's 6 sprints as well. Having only 4 power units for that is a challenge. And to be fair, most teams will just take 5 and they'll take a penalty. I think that's the issue with the limit, is that if you make the limit 5, they'll probably just use 6, run the power units to their maximum, or as near enough as they can realistically do, and just take a 10-place penalty at some race. Like, that is the feeling, that the teams have more to gain by just taking a 10-place penalty at Spa, or, some track where you can actually overtake, and then dealing with that, but then having the advantage on the other rounds. So the teams kind of see if they can make it with 4, but if they can't win so many rounds, it's difficult. But I don't think it's going to get to more than 4. And also F1 tries to push this whole sustainability thing, so I guess that might be part of the discussion as well. I don't know. But a few interesting interview things happening over the last couple of days. Hamilton's also talking about the Rwanda possibility. There's been rumours of a potential Rwandan Grand Prix. Not far after, to be fair, talk about the Kyalami Grand Prix in South Africa. That's maybe a possibility. But Hamilton says, look, we can't just ignore Africa. So no one gives anything to Africa, he says. So we'll see if we can get a Grand Prix back on the continent in the near future. But the big quote of yesterday, really, and today, came out on the Max Verstappen saga again. This time not the drama with Red Bull, although that's still pretty interesting, right? This was his year last year, and it was actually a year ago today, as in, literally today, where he was crowned the world champion during, famously, the sprint race in Qatar, which is the first time that's ever happened, of course, because sprint races only just exist in Formula 1, and of course capping off that absolutely remarkable season. Certainly the winning all the races and then to the end of the year was absurd, and how times have changed in many respects for Max and Red Bull. I mean, look at the numbers of that season he had last year and then compare it to how things are currently going. It's not exactly gone to plan, at least after the start of the season. But it's not just the on-track stuff, it's also the off-track drama. Not just Red Bull stuff though, but also with the FIA. We know that as Max has got more confident maybe and comfortable in the position that he is as the reigning world champion and the dominant figure of the sport, he has been very willing to give it back to the FIA, the governing body, as, to be fair, all the great champions have done. And this, of course, came to a head recently when Max made, basically said the car was effed or whatever in some press conference, and then he was given a warning and then some community service going into the Singapore Grand Prix. Now, we don't know if he's ever going to have to do that. Max said, I don't even know what that is. Maybe I've got got to turn up to some sort of Zoom call, I don't know, do some sort of sensitivity training or something. And the point of the FIA is that, okay, the drivers shouldn't swear because it's bad and the kids don't, it's bad for the kids or like role models, whatever, this type of stuff. The reality is they first complained about the drivers swearing in the car, which is like, you can't police that, especially because the only issue with that stuff becoming public is because the broadcasters can choose or not to broadcast it. So that's where the conversation is, rather than with the drivers. And, I get it. In an FIA sanctioned official press conference with all the drivers, the rule maybe should be there, and it's an understandable rule, no swearing, no bad language, whatever. And I get that, it's a fair rule. But just the way, in my opinion, I'm okay with that. I just think it should have been handled way differently with the drivers, right? How about a conversation to say to the drivers, look, ideally, we want you to tone your language down if possible, we'd appreciate it, And I think the drivers have said, you know what, fair enough, that's okay. But when Max then says one word and then gets lambasted by the FIA, the governing body, the president of the FIA and all this stuff as all of a sudden a massive problem, then you can't expect not to get massive backlash from the drivers, the fans, the community in general. And of course, Max handled this very admirably, in my opinion, where he basically said, okay, I'm not going to talk to you guys anymore. Clearly you don't want me to talk, so I'm not going to. And I'm just going to sit there and give one-word answers. And I am going to speak to the media. It's nothing against the media that Max has in this occasion. He's going to do his own press conferences. And this is what he did outside of the Singapore Grand Prix paddock. They're all over the place with the phones, trying to get Max's perspective, and he basically ran his own press conference. And then there was some member of the FIA that was spotted in Red Bull's hospitality, potentially telling Red Bull, we can't have this, or Max has got to do it by the book and all this. So the drama's been going on, obviously. And then Max went to the press conference and he said, no comment on that question. I've got a problem with my voice. I don't want to talk about it. And this is now continued in other sports. We've got other FIA sanctioned sports, right? So we've got other motorsports in the rally world where some of their drivers have got the same thing and they're saying, right, we're not going to talk either, right? So it's a massive problem. The question, I guess, is what do people think about this and what will the repercussions, if any, potentially be? Karun Chanok gives, a reasonably sensible take and saying penalising them for speaking when they're emotional just feels a bit harsh. I'd probably go further than that, but sure, he's on the right side of the argument, in my opinion. The question, though, is there something else happening here? So Johnny Herbert, a steward at the Singapore Grand Prix, former F1 driver, of course, as well, back in the day, and has been a steward with the FIA for some time. Actually, he is siding, which maybe makes sense because he works for the FIA, with the FIA, and says that, his language was unacceptable. And apparently that was also echoed by at least one of the drivers. So what do we think about this? He's being told, or he's telling us, that one driver at the meeting with the drivers afterwards made his opinion that swearing is not acceptable. Now, I will say this is a very biased way to frame it anyway, just because the way that Johnny Herbert seems to be framing it is that, well, swearing is unacceptable and therefore this is bad. Whereas what he's actually saying is one of the 20 drivers, 95% of drivers seemingly sided with Max, 5% of drivers didn't side with Max. So it's a pretty overwhelming majority for this is stupid. And but nonetheless, who might have said this? Who says that it's not acceptable? Who is effectively saying, screw you, Max, I don't think we should be doing this and I'm siding with the FIA type thing. So there's been some questions about who this might have been. Would it have been someone vocal enough to say? I think that's the first thing. If it's a driver that we're not expecting to be so vocal, it's not going to be a Yuki, because Yuki's going to be vocal and he loves to swear. So it's not going to be him. So you can rule out certain drivers. It's not going to be Hamilton, because Lewis literally backed up Max in the press conference at that time when he was, third for the Singapore Grand Prix, and said this whole thing was ridiculous. I don't think Max should do the service. He definitely is siding with Max there. It rumoured potentially Alonso, just because Alonso apparently said after that whole saga that, fans tell you that you're their inspiration. This kind of thing reminds us that there are lots of people watching. When you're a driver, you have to behave properly. Then the fans can give you a lot of love, a lot of motivation, a lot of responsibility for what they expect from you, basically. You have to be prepared to be a role model when you want to be, and when you don't too. When you want to say something that's not correct, you have to control yourself and be politically correct, he says. So I don't think Alonso is necessarily wrong, but he does say, look, being a role model is important, and therefore, if there was one driver that maybe behind the scenes said that he sides with the FIA on this, maybe it would be Alonso. That is, of course, speculation on our part, right? But Max was actually asked about this going into the Austin Grand Prix. What are you going to do? Are you going to talk to the media again? So Max said the following: I find it, of course, ridiculous what happened, so why should I give them full answers? I prefer then not to speak, to save my voice. We can do the interviews also somewhere else if you need some answers to the questions asked. And, of course, we had some other quotes quote as well. And it was pretty interesting where he said, first of all, let's just take a break from this. You know, in F1, you go at it again in Austin. Let's see where we're at. And then he was asked basically whether he would talk to Ben Sulayem about the situation, the president of the FIA. And he said, I will always be myself. I will not, because of that, change how I am in my life anyway, but also how I'm operating here. And basically just refused to say whether he would actually talk to the president of the FIA or not. But pretty much he says, not no, I'm not going to speak, but he says like it's definitely a possibility that he won't be having a conversation with the FIA president and just the media in general when they get on to the next round in Austin. So yeah, intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. I think Max is probably frustrated by numerous things right now, not just the FIA drama with the swearing and all this, but also just the on-track performance from Red Bull. He does say, though, Max, that, you know, given the backer upgrade Red Bull brought, he does think they're in a better spot, and they've got a big upgrade in the works for Austin as well. So Verstappen's feeling is the worst is potentially behind them in terms of car behaviour. I think that's the feeling from Max, that the car is probably going to behave better from now on, and the worst is behind it in terms of like car performance. But the question is that enough, right? Because if the McLarens are faster, if the Ferraris are faster, if the Mercedes on some weekends are faster, then Verstappen, even if he doesn't hate driving the car anymore, won't necessarily be winning races. And that, of course, is a major problem for his championship ambitions. But very much intrigued to your thoughts, as ever, on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.